Everybody, my name's Ed. Okay, I got hit with the four creators tag. I was tagged by ETA Nick and Sleepy Reader 666. Okay, so the way I got into comics, I was really young, so I was like maybe about 10 years old or so. So at that age, you're not really even reading the credits and things with comics, you're not really thinking about the creators. You're not necessarily thinking about the artists and the writers and the editors and stuff like that. You're just thinking about the characters and I just got into the fact that there was this whole world of superheroes and stuff like that. I was reading mostly Marvel and some DC, and it was just whether or not that I liked them or not. After a little bit, then I did start realizing that the reason that some of these comics and stuff were good or I liked them had to do with the people who were, creating them, the people who were producing them. But the first thing I noticed was like the artists, and that's what I would pay attention to. I stopped reading comic books for maybe a while, and when I got back into it, then I started paying a lot more attention to like the writers, people like, uh, you know, I don't know, like Jim Starlin. Actually, I wasn't, well, I'll be honest. I had come across stuff like Jim Starlin when I was like 10 years old, and this stuff was completely over my head. Like I said, I stopped reading when I got back into comics when I was like 20 or 21. Then I went back to and reread that stuff, and it's like, wow, you know what I mean? But getting into, like I said, writers like uh, Don McGregor, Steve Englehart, realizing the difference between Jim Shooter's Avengers and, say, like I said, Steve Englehart's Avengers, and Roger Stern and people like that. Uh, but going back, the first people I started noticing when I was paying attention to creators were the artists, and the first artist that really kind of stuck out to me was Gil Kane. Gil Kane what had been in the industry for a long time, had been in the industry for a couple of decades at that point, and I don't know what struck me about it. It just seemed to me that his style when he was at Marvel just was really distinctive, kind of idiosyncratic, like in the mid 70s or even before then, but I found out about it in the mid late 70s. He was doing a lot of cover work for Marvel. Matter of fact, like around 1977, if he wasn't doing a cover for Marvel, then Jack Kirby was doing a cover for Marvel. But before then, even going backwards, I discovered he was doing almost every other cover for every other Marvel comic that was coming out, like I said, in the early mid 70s. And his interior work was really interesting to me. I think it was kind of, I'm not so sure he was doing too many things regularly, but he would do a comic here, a comic there, do a little stretch on something, and then do something else. I think I really discovered it and started appreciating it. Like I said, it's the late 70s, and they were reprinting his run on the Amazing Spider-Man from some years earlier. They used to have a comic called Marvel Tales that were Spider-Man reprints, and like I said, these comics may have come out in like 69, 70 or whatever, and that's how I got introduced to like his interior work. And it was really, let's see here. I mean, I wouldn't have had these words to describe it back then, but it was really, his action scenes were really kinetic. I mean, his figures were really lean. Somebody like hit somebody with a roundhouse right or a haymaker, it seemed like, those fists were coming out of way out of left field, and when somebody got hit, they didn't just get hit, they were just like flailing about, you know what I mean? And he really put you in the thick of things, and it was really interesting. Like I said, connecting it to what I know about these artists now versus what I knew when I was a kid. It was just really interesting to see how he's able to adapt to that kind of Marvel style of just all out action. He did earlier work for DC with the Atom and Green Lantern or whatever. Oh, another thing that stuck out to me, a lot of times when there was a scene where people were talking or whatever, he'd angle people's faces and stuff like that, where you get these kind of up the nose shots or whatever. where you're looking at the character, like I said, kind of from a low angle, and you can just see their nostrils, and it was just a stylistic thing that just kind of like stood out. So I'd say if Jill Kane was the first person that kind of caught my attention. Next guy that kind of caught my attention was George Perez, and George Perez basically caught my attention because I was reading a lot of Avengers comics at that time, and like I said, that's right when you had like the guys that are writing comics, and like I said, I didn't pay too much attention to it then, but I know it now. Um, Steve Englehart gave way to Gary Conway, who gave way to like Jim Shooter, and a lot of those stories really made an impression on me. But you could also see how George Perez's art kind of progressed. You start out when I think he started like around issue 141, and even a couple of years later, how uh, how much his art had progressed. Big figures, bold figures, really great action choreography. And the thing about George Perez was he really had this crazy eye for detail. I remember reading in an interview where he said he was influenced by Barry Smith, and Barry Smith had said something like, if there's a vase that's broken, always draw more glass than could have ever been in that vase to begin with. And you saw that with his rubble. If there was a destruction scene, if he was drawing computers, there would be a wall of computers with all kinds of gizmos and gadgets and buttons and things. If you look in his background, you see his cityscapes. Just these crazy buildings that are back there. You know what I mean? And it was just really. I mean, it just really well, it just really stood out to me. I think he really hit his stride though when he went to DC and he started drawing for the Teen Titans. That's where like George Perez really, really, really blossomed. That's when he really got distinctive. Really, I think his figure work and his facial work and things like that really improved. And you were getting George not only just drawing great backgrounds with every brick in every wall and every leaf in every tree, but he got really distinctive with drawing faces and body types and things like that. And I think he's actually really unparalleled with that. I think I read someplace where I think it might have been the same interview where somebody asked him, what heroes did you want to draw? And he says, I want to draw them all, And you look at the stuff that he did again, when he was at DC doing stuff like Crisis on Infinite Earths, he'd have to draw on a page like 20 different characters, and he would do it. He would draw 20 different characters. I think people don't. I'm not sure if everybody remembers the mid 70s or knows about this, but back in the mid 70s, right when George took over the Avengers was a comic book a lot of artists didn't really want to draw because they thought it was extra work. You got to remember, people just got their page rate and that was it. So you weren't getting, for putting extra work in it, you weren't getting, royalties or anything like that like you do now. And a lot of people thought it was extra work. They'd rather draw Iron Man or Spider-Man, where they just have to draw 2 or 3 characters, as opposed to like the Avengers, where you have to draw at least a half a dozen. George was a guy that went in there that would draw all those characters and not cheat at all or whatever. Next guy I kind of got into, which vaguely around the same time as late 70s started hitting into the early 80s, was John Byrne. John Byrne pretty much became the regular artist on the Avengers after George left, and at the same time he was drawing the X-Men, and I just kind of dug his, idiosyncratic style, or it's not a really idiosyncratic style, but it was a distinctive style. You looked at John Byrne's work and you knew it was him. I think he got a lot of attention with Terry Austin's art or inks, because Terry Austin had this really hard, crisp, I guess that's when I say hard, crisp inking style that really brought the best out in him. And yeah, I mean, it was just really pleasant to look at. Like I said, he worked in the same way that George Perez worked, and Neil Adams, maybe Neil Adams to a lesser extent, John Buscema, a lot of other people, is just really working that Marvel style. Um, I really dug the stuff he was doing with the Fantastic Four. He goes from just well, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but he's doing he's doing the X-Men at a time when the X-Men were not that popular. I mean, people kind of forget the X-Men were like a bi-monthly company or comic, and people really didn't expect that much of it. I mean, they didn't get. You look at the house ads in Marvel Comics from the mid late 70s, the X-Men weren't mentioned that much. Um, I think John Byrne was also doing, black and white work. I know he did work on Star Lord. He did a lot of stuff for Marvel Team Up, along with Chris Claremont, who was his partner in the X Men. And I don't know what happened. I think him and Claremont had some sort of falling out or whatever. But John went over to the Fantastic Four, which I think is where he did some really great work as far as writing as well as artwork and whatnot. I think when he first got onto it, there was the idea that, well, John Byrne's bringing it back to the basics. He's bringing it back to the 60s FF. And he kind of did that for a while, but he also pushed the title forward as far as moving the characters forward, as far as doing little changes and things like that. And yeah, John Byrne did some of his really best work like back there during the early mid '80s for Marvel, and then of course he went on to do Superman for DC. But that's probably the golden age for John Byrne, that kind of mid '80s thing right there. And he also did that. What was it? Next Men. That's something I bought sporadically. I've got like literally just a small handful of those comics, but I kind of want to go back and kind of check some of those things out. Now, right exact that same time period, again, we're still talking about the early 80s, early mid 80s. The next guy that was a real big hero of mine or influence was Frank Miller. This is right during his first run on Daredevil. And Frank Miller was really a game changer, in my opinion. He was really innovative when it comes to like superhero art. Of course, everybody knows how he took Daredevil, which at the time or previously was seen as kind of the sort of second-rate Spider-Man-ish type comic book. I mean, people totally forget it was a really goofy, campy comic book back in the 60s. Even though you had Gene Colan doing this kind of dark, moody, expressionistic art, Frank Miller or Stan Lee back in the 60s was really writing it like a camp comic book. Mike Murdock and having people talk like they're in a Frank Sinatra movie and, hey, what's swinging toots and stuff like that, and captions where they're telling you, the third W in the whip is silent. And, all of Daredevil villains at that time were, Leapfrog and Stiltman and the Jester and Owl and stuff like that. That's what Daredevil was back then. Frank Miller comes along. They still keep with some of the campy villains for a while, but after a while, most of that stuff kind of gets pushed to the side a bit, where Frank Miller's bringing in more and more of his cheesy film noir influences and his ninjas and his this and his that, but he makes it work. I mean, it was a really different comic for the time. He threw out a lot of which was typical for the time, lots of exposition, lots of dialogue during fight scenes and stuff like that. And it was a game changer. It was really innovative. It was innovative as far as bringing forth a lot of Will Eisner influences, as far as messing around with the page layouts and things like that. Brought a whole nother. A lot of people called it cinematic style. There was a certain level of that, but I think there was also a certain level of comic book layout things that were going on there. Just art and design for the sake of art and design's sake. A lot of stuff happened in those comics that you can't do on screen, that only work if you do it on a comic book page. And I think Frank really, really, hey, how you doing? I think Frank really you just really opened up what you could and couldn't do in a change how I should say change the way people thought about what you could and couldn't do in a mainstream superhero comic, you know. And even the whole thing of opening up to a certain level of on page violence and things like that as well. Okay, so I guess that's it. I gotta thank you very much for listening, and you have a good day. Okay. Oh, okay. And I need to tag somebody, so I'm gonna tag Gippy204, the Mount Vernon Kid, and Milan Jaffic. Thanks. Have a good one.